A Marriage of Convenience, a short story by Somerset Maugham. I left Bangkok on a shabby little ship of 400 or 500 tons. The dingy saloon, which served also as dining room, had two narrow tables down its length with swivel chairs on both sides of them. The cabins were in the bowels of the ship, and they were extremely dirty. Cockroaches walked about on the floor, and however placid your temperament, it is difficult not to be startled when you go to the wash basin to wash your hands and a huge cockroach stalks leisurely out. We dropped down the river, broad and lazy and smiling, and its green banks were dotted with little huts on piles standing at the water's edge. We crossed the bar, and the open sea, blue and still, spread before me. The look of it and the smell of it filled me with elation. I had gone on board early in the morning and soon discovered that I was thrown amid the oddest collection of persons I had ever encountered. There were two French traders and a Belgian colonel, an Italian tenor, the American proprietor of a circus with his wife, and a retired French official with his. The circus proprietor was what is termed a good mixer, a type which according to your mood you fly from or welcome, but I happened to be feeling much pleased with life. And before I had been on board an hour, we had shaken for drinks, and he had shown me his animals. He was a very short, fat man, and his Stenger shifter, white but none too clean, outlined the noble proportions of his abdomen, but the collar was so tight that you wondered he did not choke. He had a red, clean-shaven face, a merry blue eye, and short, untidy, sandy hair. He wore a battered topee well on the back of his head. His name was Wilkins, and he was born in Portland, Oregon. It appears that the Oriental has a passion for the circus, and Mr. Wilkins for 20 years had been traveling up and down the east from Port Said to Yokohama, Aden, Bombay, Madras, Calcutta, Rangoon, Singapore, Penang, Bangkok, Saigon, Hue, Hanoi, Hong Kong, Shanghai. Their names roll on the tongue savorily, crowding the imagination with sunshine and strange sounds and a multicolored activity, with his menagerie and his merry-go-rounds. It was a strange life he led, unusual, and one that, one would have thought, must offer the occasion for all sorts of curious experiences. But the odd thing about him was that he was a perfectly commonplace little man, and you would have been prepared to find him running a garage or keeping a third-rate hotel in a second-rate town in California. The fact is, and I have noticed it so often that I do not know why it should always surprise me, that the extraordinariness of a man's life does not make him extraordinary, but contrariwise. If a man is extraordinary, he will make extraordinariness out of a life as humdrum as that of a country curate. I wish I could feel it reasonable to tell here the story of the hermit I went to see on an island in the Torres Straits, a shipwrecked mariner who had lived there alone for 30 years. But when you are writing a book, you are imprisoned by the four walls of your subject, and though for the entertainment of my own digressing mind, I set it down now, I should be forced in the end, by my sense of what is fit to go between two covers and what is not, to cut it out. Anyhow, the long and short of it is that notwithstanding his long and intimate communion with nature and his thoughts, the man was as dull, insensitive, and vulgar an oaf at the end of this experience as he must have been at the beginning. The Italian singer passed us, and Mr. Wilkins told me that he was a Neapolitan who was on his way to Hong Kong to rejoin his company, which he had been forced to leave owing to an attack of malaria in Bangkok. He was an enormous fellow and very fat, and when he flung himself into a chair, it creaked with dismay. He took off his topee, displayed a great head of long, curly, greasy hair, and ran podgy and beringed fingers through it. "He ain't very sociable," said Mr. Wilkins. "He took the cigar I gave him, but he wouldn't have a drink. I shouldn't wonder if there wasn't something rather queer about him. Nasty-looking guy, ain't he?" Then a little fat woman in white came on deck holding by the hand a wah-wah monkey. It walked solemnly by her side. "This is Mrs. Wilkins," said the circus proprietor, "and our youngest son. Draw up a chair, Mrs. Wilkins, and meet this gentleman. I don't know his name, but he's already paid for 2 drinks for me, and if he can't shake any better than he has yet, he'll pay for one for you too." Mrs. Wilkins sat down with an abstracted, serious look, and with her eyes on the blue sea, suggested that she did not see why she shouldn't have a lemonade. "My, it's hot," she murmured, fanning herself with the toupee which she took off. "Mrs. Wilkins feels the heat," said her husband. "She's had 20 years of it now." 22 and a half, said Mrs. Wilkins, still looking at the sea. "And she's never got used to it yet." "Nor never shall, and you know it," said Mrs. Wilkins. She was just the same size as her husband and just as fat, and she had a round red face like his and the same sandy, untidy hair. I wondered if they had married because they were so exactly alike, or if in the course of years they had acquired this astonishing resemblance. She did not turn her head, but continued to look absently at the sea. "Have you shown him the animals?" she asked. "You bet your life I have." "What did he think of Percy?" "Thought him fine." I could not but feel that I was being unduly left out of a conversation of which I was at all events partly the subject, so I asked, "Who's Percy?" "Percy's our eldest son. There's a flying fish, Elmer. He's the orang-utan. Did he eat his food well this morning?" "Fine. He's the biggest orang-utan in captivity. I wouldn't take $1,000 for him." "And what relation is the elephant?" I asked. Mrs. Wilkins did not look at me, but with her blue eyes still gazed indifferently at the sea. "He's no relation," she answered, "only a friend." The boy brought lemonade for Mrs. Wilkins, a whiskey and soda for her husband, and a gin and tonic for me. We shook dice, and I signed the chit. "It must come expensive if he always loses when he shakes," Mrs. Wilkins murmured to the coastline. "I guess Egbert would like a sip of your lemonade, my dear," said Mr. Wilkins. Mrs. Wilkins slightly turned her head and looked at the monkey sitting on her lap. "Would you like a sip of Mother's lemonade, Egbert?" The monkey gave a little squeak, and putting her arm round him, she handed him a straw. The monkey sucked up a little lemonade, and having drunk enough, sank back against Mrs. Wilkins' ample bosom. "Mrs. Wilkins thinks the world of Egbert," said her husband. "You can't wonder at it. He's her youngest." Mrs. Wilkins took another straw and thoughtfully drank her lemonade. "Egbert's all right," she remarked. "There's nothing wrong with Egbert." Just then the French official, who had been sitting down, got up and began walking up and down. He had been accompanied on board by the French minister at Bangkok, 1 or 2 secretaries, and a prince of the royal family. There had been a great deal of bowing and shaking of hands, and as the ship slipped away from the quay, much waving of hats and handkerchiefs. He was evidently a person of consequence. I had heard the captain address him as Monsieur le Gouverneur. "That's the big noise on this boat," said Mr. Wilkins. "He was governor of one of the French colonies, and now he's making a tour of the world. He came to see my circus at Bangkok. I guess I'll ask him what he'll have. What shall I call him, my dear?" Mrs. Wilkins slowly turned her head and looked at the Frenchman, with the rosette of the Legion of Honor in his buttonhole, pacing up and down. "Don't call him anything," she said. "Show him a hoop, and he'll jump right through it." I could not but laugh. Monsieur le Gouverneur was a little man, well below the average height, and smally made, with a very ugly little face and thick, almost negroid features, and he had a bushy grey head, bushy grey eyebrows, and a bushy grey moustache. He did look a little like a poodle, and he had the poodle's soft, intelligent, and shining eyes. Next time he passed us, Mr. Wilkins called out, "Monsieur, qu'est-ce que vous prenez?" I cannot reproduce the eccentricities of his accent. "Un petit verre de Porto." He turned to me. "Foreigners, they all drink Porto. You're always safe with that." "Not the Dutch," said Mrs. Wilkins, with a look at the sea. "They won't touch nothing but schnapps." The distinguished Frenchman stopped and looked at Mr. Wilkins with some bewilderment, whereupon Mr. Wilkins tapped his breast and said, "Moa, propriétaire cirque, vous avez visité." Then, for a reason that escaped me, Mr. Wilkins made his arms into a hoop and outlined the gestures that represented a poodle jumping through it. Then he pointed at the wah-wah that Mrs. Wilkins was still holding on her lap. "La petite fils de mon femme," he said. Light broke upon the governor, and he burst into a peculiarly musical and infectious laugh. Mr. Wilkins began laughing too. "Oui, oui," he cried. "Moi, circus proprietor, une petite verre de Porto, oui, oui, n'est-ce pas?" "Mr. Wilkins talks French like a Frenchman," Mrs. Wilkins informed the passing sea. "Mais très volontiers," said the governor, still smiling. I drew him up a chair, and he sat down with a bow to Mrs. Wilkins. "Tell Poodleface his name's Egbert," she said, looking at the sea. I called the boy, and we ordered a round of drinks. "You sign the chit, Elmer," she said. "It's not a bit of good mister. What's his name shakin' if he can't shake nothing better than a pair of trays?" "Vous comprenez le français, madame?" asked the governor politely. "He wants to know if you speak French, my dear." "Where does he think I was raised? Naples?" Then the governor, with exuberant gesticulation, burst into a torrent of English so fantastic that it required all my knowledge of French to understand what he was talking about. Presently Mr. Wilkins took him down to look at his animals, and a little later we assembled in the stuffy saloon for luncheon. The governor's wife appeared and was put on the captain's right. The governor explained to her who we all were, and she gave us a gracious bow. She was a large woman, tall and of a robust build, of 55 perhaps, and she was dressed somewhat severely in black silk. On her head she wore a huge round topee. Her features were so large and regular, her form so statuesque, that you were reminded of the massive females who take part in processions. She would have admirably suited the role of Columbia or Britannia in a patriotic demonstration. She towered over her diminutive husband like a skyscraper over a shack. He talked incessantly, with vivacity and wit, and when he said anything amusing, her heavy features relaxed into a large, fond smile. "Que tu es bête, mon ami," she said. She turned to the captain. "You must not pay any attention to him. He is always like that." We had indeed a very amusing meal, and when it was over, we separated to our various cabins to sleep away the heat of the afternoon. In such a small ship, having once made the acquaintance of my fellow passengers, it would have been impossible, even had I wished it, not to pass with them every moment of the day that I was not in my cabin. The only person who held himself aloof was the Italian tenor. He spoke to no one, but sat by himself as far forward as he could get, twanging a guitar in an undertone so that you had to strain your ears to catch the notes. We remained in sight of land, and the sea was like a pail of milk. Talking of one thing and another, we watched the day decline, we dined, and then we sat out again on deck under the stars. The two traders played piquet in the hot saloon, but the Belgian colonel joined our little group. He was shy and fat and opened his mouth only to utter a civility. Soon, influenced perhaps by the night and encouraged by the darkness that gave him, up there in the bows, the sensation of being alone with the sea, the Italian tenor, accompanying himself on his guitar, began to sing, first in a low tone and then a little louder, till presently, his music captivating him, he sang with all his might. He had the real Italian voice, all macaroni, olive oil and sunshine, and he sang the Neapolitan songs that I had heard in my youth in the Piazza San Ferdinando, and fragments from La Bohème and Traviata and Rigoletto. He sang with emotion and false emphasis, and his tremolo reminded you of every third-rate Italian tenor you had ever heard. But there, in the openness of that lovely night, his exaggerations only made you smile, and you could not but feel in your heart a lazy, sensual pleasure. He sang for an hour, perhaps, and we all fell silent. Then he was still, but he did not move, and we saw his huge bulk dimly outlined against the luminous sky. I saw that the little French governor had been holding the hand of his large wife, and the sight was absurd and touching. "Do you know that this is the anniversary of the day on which I first saw my wife?" he said, suddenly breaking the silence which had certainly weighed on him, for I had never met a more loquacious creature. "It is also the anniversary of the day on which she promised to be my wife, and which will surprise you, they were one and the same." "Voyons, mon ami," said the lady, "you are not going to bore our friends with that old story. You are really quite insupportable." But she spoke with a smile on her large, firm face, and in a tone that suggested that she was quite willing to hear it again. "But it will interest them, mon petit chou?" It was in this way that he always addressed his wife, and it was funny to hear this imposing and even majestic lady thus addressed by her small husband. "Will it not, monsieur?" he asked me. "It is a romance, and who does not like romance, especially on such a night as this?" I assured the governor that we were all anxious to hear, and the Belgian colonel took the opportunity once more to be polite. "You see, ours was a marriage of convenience, pure and simple." "C'est vrai," said the lady. "It would be stupid to deny it. But sometimes love comes after marriage and not before, and then it is better. It lasts longer." I could not but notice that the governor gave her hand an affectionate little squeeze. You see, I had been in the Navy, and when I retired I was 49. I was strong and active, and I was very anxious to find an occupation. I looked about. I pulled all the strings I could. Fortunately, I had a cousin who had some political importance. It is one of the advantages of democratic government that if you have sufficient influence, merit, which otherwise might pass unnoticed, generally receives its due reward. "You are modesty itself, mon pauvre ami," said she, and presently I was sent for by the minister to the colonies and offered the post of governor in a certain colony. It was a very distant spot that they wished to send me to, and a lonely one. But I had spent my life wandering from port to port, and that was not a matter that troubled me. I accepted with joy. The minister told me that I must be ready to start in a month. I told him that would be easy for an old bachelor who had nothing much in the world but a few clothes and a few books. "Comment, mon lieutenant," he cried. "You are a bachelor?" "Certainly," I answered, "and I have every intention of remaining one." "In that case, I am afraid I must withdraw my offer. For this position, it is essential that you should be married." It is too long a story to tell you, but the gist of it was that owing to the scandal my predecessor, a bachelor, had caused by having native girls to live in the residency, and the consequent complaints of the white people, planters, and the wives of functionaries, it had been decided that the next governor must be a model of respectability. I expostulated. I argued. I recapitulated my services to the country and the services my cousin could render at the next elections. Nothing would serve. The minister was adamant. "But what can I do?" I cried with dismay. "You can marry," said the minister. "Mais voyons, monsieur le ministre, I do not know any women. I am not a ladies' man, and I am 49. How do you expect me to find a wife?" "Nothing is more simple. Put an advertisement in the paper." I was confounded. I did not know what to say. "Well, think it over," said the minister. "If you can find a wife in a month, you can go, but no wife, no job. That is my last word." He smiled a little. To him the situation was not without humor. And if you think of advertising, I recommend the Figaro. I walked away from the ministry with death in my heart. I knew the place to which they desired to appoint me, and I knew it would suit me very well to live there. The climate was tolerable, and the residency was spacious and comfortable. The notion of being a governor was far from displeasing me, and having nothing much but my pension as a naval officer, the salary was not to be despised. Suddenly I made up my mind. I walked to the offices of the Figaro, composed an advertisement and handed it in for insertion. But I can tell you, when I walked up the Champs-Élysées afterwards, my heart was beating much more furiously than it had ever done when my ship was stripped for action. The governor leaned forward and put his hand impressively on my knee. Mon cher monsieur, you will never believe it, but I had 4,372 replies. It was an avalanche. I had expected half a dozen. I had to take a cab to take the letters to my hotel. My room was swamped with them. There were 4,372 women who were willing to share my solitude and be a governor's lady. It was staggering. They were of all ages from 17 to 70. There were maidens of irreproachable ancestry and the highest culture. There were unmarried ladies who had made a little slip at one period of their career and now desired to regularize their situation. There were widows whose husbands had died in the most harrowing circumstances, and there were widows whose children would be a solace to my old age. They were blonde and dark, tall and short, fat and thin. Some could speak 5 languages, and others could play the piano. Some offered me love, and some craved for it. Some could only give me a solid friendship, but mingled with esteem. Some had a fortune, and others golden prospects. I was overwhelmed. I was bewildered. At last I lost my temper, for I am a passionate man, and I got up and I stamped on all those letters and all those photographs, and I cried, I will marry none of them. It was hopeless. I had less than a month now, and I could not see over 4,000 aspirants to my hand in that time. I felt that if I did not see them all, I should be tortured for the rest of my life by the thought that I had missed the one woman the fates had destined to make me happy. I gave it up as a bad job. I went out of my room hideous with all those photographs and littered papers, and to drive care away went onto the boulevard and sat down at the Café de la Paix. After a time, I saw a friend passing, and he nodded to me and smiled. I tried to smile, but my heart was sore. I realized that I must spend the years that remained to me in a cheap pension at Toulon or Brest as an officier de marine en retraite. Zoot! My friend stopped, and coming up to me sat down. What is making you look so glum, mon cher? He asked me. You who are the gayest of mortals. I was glad to have someone in whom I could confide my troubles, and told him the whole story. He laughed consumedly. I have thought since that perhaps the incident had its comic side, but at the time, I assure you, I could see in it nothing to laugh at. I mentioned the fact to my friend, not without asperity, and then, controlling his mirth as best he could, he said to me, "But, my dear fellow, do you really want to marry?" At this, I entirely lost my temper. "You are completely idiotic," I said. "If I did not want to marry, and what is more, marry at once, within the next fortnight, do you imagine that I should have spent 3 days reading love letters from women I have never set eyes on?" "Calm yourself and listen to me," he replied. "I have a cousin who lives in Geneva. She is Swiss du reste, and she belongs to a family of the greatest respectability in the Republic. Her morals are without reproach. She is of a suitable age, a spinster, for she has spent the last 15 years nursing an invalid mother who has lately died. She is well educated, and par-dessus le marché, she is not ugly." "It sounds as though she were a paragon," I said. "I do not say that, but she has been well brought up, and would become the position you have to offer her. There is one thing you forget. What inducement would there be for her to give up her friends and her accustomed life to accompany in exile a man of 49 who is by no means a beauty?" Monsieur le Gouverneur broke off his narrative and, shrugging his shoulders so emphatically that his head almost sank between them, turned to us. "I am ugly. I admit it. I am of an ugliness that does not inspire terror or respect, but only ridicule, and that is the worst ugliness of all. When people see me for the first time, they do not shrink with horror. There would evidently be something flattering in that. They burst out laughing. Listen, when the admirable Mr. Wilkins showed me his animals this morning, Percy, the orang-utan, held out his arms, and but for the bars of the cage, would have clasped me to his bosom as a long-lost brother. Once, indeed, when I was at the Jardin des Plantes in Paris and was told that one of the anthropoid apes had escaped, I made my way to the exit as quickly as I could in fear that, mistaking me for the refugee, they would seize me and, notwithstanding my expostulations, shut me up in the monkey house. "Voyons, mon ami," said Madame his wife in her deep, slow voice, "you are talking even greater nonsense than usual. I do not say that you are an Apollo. In your position, it is unnecessary that you should be, but you have dignity, you have poise, you are what any woman would call a fine man." I will resume my story. When I made this remark to my friend, he replied, "One can never tell with women. There is something about marriage that wonderfully attracts them. There would be no harm in asking her. After all, it is regarded as a compliment by a woman to be asked in marriage. She can but refuse. But I do not know your cousin, and I do not see how I am to make her acquaintance. I cannot go to her house, ask to see her, and when I am shown into the drawing-room say, 'Voilà, I have come to ask you to marry me.' She would think I was a lunatic and scream for help. Besides, I am a man of an extreme timidity, and I could never take such a step." "I will tell you what to do," said my friend. "Go to Geneva and take her a box of chocolates from me. She will be glad to have news of me and will receive you with pleasure. You can have a little talk, and then if you do not like the look of her, you take your leave and no harm is done. If, on the other hand, you do, we can go into the matter, and you can make a formal demand for her hand." I was desperate. It seemed the only thing to do. We went to a shop at once and bought an enormous box of chocolates, and that night I took the train to Geneva. No sooner had I arrived than I sent her a letter to say that I was the bearer of a gift from her cousin, and much wished to give myself the pleasure of delivering it in person. Within an hour I received her reply to the effect that she would be pleased to receive me at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I spent the interval before my mirror, and 17 times I tied and retied my tie. As the clock struck 4, I presented myself at the door of her house, and was immediately ushered into the drawing-room. She was waiting for me. Her cousin said she was not ugly. Imagine my surprise to see a young woman, a woman still young, of a noble presence, with the dignity of Juno, the features of Venus, and in her expression the intelligence of Minerva. "You are too absurd," said Madame. "But by now these gentlemen know that one cannot believe all you say." I swear to you that I do not exaggerate. I was so taken aback that I nearly dropped the box of chocolates. But I said to myself, "La garde meurt mais ne se rend pas." I presented the box of chocolates. I gave her news of her cousin. I found her amiable. We talked for a quarter of an hour, and then I said to myself, "Allons-y." I said to her, "Mademoiselle, I must tell you that I did not come here merely to give you a box of chocolates." She smiled and remarked that evidently I must have had reasons to come to Geneva of more importance than that. "I came to ask you to do me the honor of marrying me." She gave a start. "But, monsieur, you are mad," she said. "I beseech you not to answer till you have heard the facts," I interrupted, and before she could say another word, I told her the whole story. I told her about my advertisement in the Figaro, and she laughed till the tears ran down her face. Then I repeated my offer. "You are serious?" she asked. "I have never been more serious in my life." "I will not deny that your offer has come as a surprise. I had not thought of marrying, I have passed the age, but evidently your offer is not one that a woman should refuse without consideration. I am flattered. Will you give me a few days to reflect?" "Mademoiselle, I am absolutely desolated," I replied, "but I have not time. If you will not marry me, I must go back to Paris and resume my perusal of the 15 or 1800 letters that still await my attention. It is quite evident that I cannot possibly give you an answer at once. I had not set eyes on you a quarter of an hour ago. I must consult my friends and my family. What have they got to do with it? You are of full age. The matter is pressing. I cannot wait. I have told you everything. You are an intelligent woman. What can prolonged reflection add to the impulse of the moment? You are not asking me to say yes or no this very minute? That is outrageous. That is exactly what I am asking. My train goes back to Paris in a couple of hours. She looked at me reflectively. You are quite evidently a lunatic. You ought to be shut up both for your own safety and that of the public. Well, which is it to be? I said. Yes or no? She shrugged her shoulders. Mon Dieu. She waited a minute, and I was on tenterhooks. Yes. The governor waved his hand towards his wife. And there she is. We were married in a fortnight, and I became governor of a colony. I married a jewel, my dear sirs, a woman of the most charming character, 1 in 1,000, a woman of a masculine intelligence and a feminine sensibility, an admirable woman. But hold your tongue, mon ami, his wife said. You are making me as ridiculous as yourself. He turned to the Belgian colonel. Are you a bachelor, mon colonel? If so, I strongly recommend you to go to Geneva. It is a nest, une pépinière was the word he used, of the most adorable young women. You will find a wife there as nowhere else. Geneva is besides a charming city. Do not waste a minute, but go there, and I will give you a letter to my wife's nieces. It was she who summed up the story. The fact is that in a marriage of convenience you expect less, and so you are less likely to be disappointed. As you do not make senseless claims on one another, there is no reason for exasperation. You do not look for perfection, and so you are tolerant to one another's faults. Passion is all very well, but it is not a proper foundation for marriage. Voyez-vous, for two people to be happy in marriage, they must be able to respect one another, they must be of the same condition, and their interests must be alike. Then if they are decent people, and are willing to give and take, to live and let live, there is no reason why their union should not be as happy as ours. She paused. But of course my husband is a very, very remarkable man.
The Facts of Life, a short story by Somerset Maugham. It was Henry Garnet's habit on leaving the city of an afternoon to drop in at his club and play bridge before going home to dinner. He was a pleasant man to play with, he knew the game well, and you could be sure that he would make the best of his cards. He was a good loser, and when he won was more inclined to ascribe his success to his luck than to his skill. He was indulgent, and if his partner made a mistake, could be trusted to find an excuse for him. It was surprising then, on this occasion, to hear him telling his partner with unnecessary sharpness that he had never seen a hand worse played. And it was more surprising still to see him not only make a grave error himself, an error of which you would never have thought him capable, but when his partner, not unwilling to get a little of his own back, pointed it out, insist against all reason, and with considerable heat, that he was perfectly right. But they were all old friends, the men he was playing with, and none of them took his ill humour very seriously. Henry Garnet was a broker, a partner in a firm of repute, and it occurred to one of them that something had gone wrong with some stock he was interested in. "How's the market today?" he asked. "Booming. Even the suckers are making money." It was evident that stocks and shares had nothing to do with Henry Garnet's vexation. But something was the matter. That was evident too. He was a hearty fellow who enjoyed excellent health. He had plenty of money. He was fond of his wife and devoted to his children. As a rule, he had high spirits, and he laughed easily at the nonsense they were apt to talk while they played. But today he sat glum and silent. His brows were crossly puckered, and there was a sulky look about his mouth. Presently, to ease the tension, one of the others mentioned a subject upon which they all knew Henry Garnet was glad to speak. "How's your boy, Henry? I see he's done pretty well in the tournament." Henry Garnet's frown grew darker. "He's done no better than I expected him to." "When does he come back from Monte?" "He got back last night." "Did he enjoy himself?" "I suppose so. All I know is that he made a damned fool of himself." "Oh, how?" "I'd rather not talk about it if you don't mind." The three men looked at him with curiosity. Henry Garnet scowled at the green baize. "Sorry, old boy, your call." The game proceeded in a strained silence. Garnet got his bid, and when he played his cards so badly that he went 3 down, not a word was said. Another rubber was begun, and in the second game, Garnet denied a suit. Having none, his partner asked him. Garnet's irritability was such that he did not even reply, and when at the end of the hand it appeared that he had revoked, and that his revoke cost the rubber, it was not to be expected that his partner should let his carelessness go without remark. "What the devil's the matter with you, Henry?" he said. "You're playing like a fool." Garnet was disconcerted. He did not so much mind losing a big rubber himself, but he was sore that his inattention should have made his partner lose too. He pulled himself together. "I'd better not play any more. I thought a few rubbers would calm me. But the fact is, I can't give my mind to the game. To tell you the truth, I'm in a hell of a temper." They all burst out laughing. "You don't have to tell us that, old boy. It's obvious." Garnet gave them a rueful smile. "Well, I bet you'd be in a temper if what's happened to me had happened to you. As a matter of fact, I'm in a damned awkward situation, and if any of you fellows can give me any advice how to deal with it, I'd be grateful. Let's have a drink and you tell us all about it. With a KC, a Home Office official and an eminent surgeon, if we can't tell you how to deal with a situation, nobody can." The KC got up and rang the bell for a waiter. "It's about that damned boy of mine," said Henry Garnet. Drinks were ordered and brought, and this is the story that Henry Garnet told them. The boy of whom he spoke was his only son. His name was Nicholas, and of course he was called Nicky. He was 18. The Garnets had 2 daughters besides, one of 16 and the other of 12. But however unreasonable it seemed, for a father is generally supposed to like his daughters best, and though he did all he could not to show his preference, there was no doubt that the greater share of Henry Garnet's affection was given to his son. He was kind in a chaffing, casual way to his daughters, and gave them handsome presents on their birthdays and at Christmas. But he doted on Nicky. Nothing was too good for him. He thought the world of him. He could hardly take his eyes off him. You could not blame him, for Nicky was a son that any parent might have been proud of. He was 6'2", lithe but muscular, with broad shoulders and a slim waist, and he held himself gallantly erect. He had a charming head, well placed on the shoulders, with pale brown hair that waved slightly, blue eyes with long dark lashes under well-marked eyebrows, a full red mouth and a tanned clean skin. When he smiled, he showed very regular and very white teeth. He was not shy, but there was a modesty in his demeanor that was attractive. In social intercourse, he was easy, polite, and quietly gay. He was the offspring of nice, healthy, decent parents. He had been well brought up in a good home. He had been sent to a good school, and the general result was as engaging a specimen of young manhood as you were likely to find in a long time. You felt that he was as honest, open, and virtuous as he looked. He had never given his parents a moment's uneasiness. As a child, he was seldom ill and never naughty. As a boy, he did everything that was expected of him. His school reports were excellent. He was wonderfully popular, and he ended his career with a creditable number of prizes as head of the school and captain of the football team. But this was not all. At the age of 14, Nicky had developed an unexpected gift for lawn tennis. This was a game that his father not only was fond of, but played very well, and when he discerned in the boy the promise of a tennis player, he fostered it. During the holidays, he had him taught by the best professionals, and by the time he was 16, he had won a number of tournaments for boys of his age. He could beat his father so badly that only parental affection reconciled the older player to the poor show he put up. At 18, Nicky went to Cambridge, and Henry Garnet conceived the ambition that before he was through with the university, he should play for it. Nicky had all the qualifications for becoming a great tennis player. He was tall, he had a long reach, he was quick on his feet, and his timing was perfect. He realized instinctively where the ball was coming, and seemingly without hurry, was there to take it. He had a powerful serve, with a nasty break that made it difficult to return, and his forehand drive, low, long, and accurate, was deadly. He was not so good on the backhand, and his volleying was wild. But all through the summer before he went to Cambridge, Henry Garnet made him work on these points under the best teacher in England. At the back of his mind, though he did not even mention it to Nicky, he cherished a further ambition, to see his son play at Wimbledon, and who could tell, perhaps be chosen to represent his country in the Davis Cup. A great lump came into Henry Garnet's throat as he saw in fancy his son leap over the net to shake hands with the American champion whom he had just defeated, and walk off the court to the deafening plaudits of the multitude. As an assiduous frequenter of Wimbledon, Henry Garnet had a good many friends in the tennis world, and one evening he found himself at a city dinner sitting next to one of them, a Colonel Brabazon, and in due course began talking to him of Nicky, and what chance there might be of his being chosen to play for his university during the following season. "Why don't you let him go down to Monte Carlo and play in the spring tournament there?" said the Colonel suddenly. "Oh, I don't think he's good enough for that. He's not 19 yet. He only went up to Cambridge last October. He wouldn't stand a chance against all those cracks. Of course, Austin and Von Cram and so on would knock spots off him, but he might snatch a game or two. And if he got up against some of the smaller fry, there's no reason why he shouldn't win 2 or 3 matches. He's never been up against any of the first-rate players, and it would be wonderful practice for him. He'd learn a lot more than he'll ever learn in the seaside tournaments you enter him for." "I wouldn't dream of it. I'm not going to let him leave Cambridge in the middle of a term. I've always impressed upon him that tennis is only a game, and it mustn't interfere with work." Colonel Brabazon asked Garnet when the term ended. "That's all right. He'd only have to cut about 3 days. Surely that could be arranged. You see, 2 of the men we were depending on have let us down, and we're in a hole. We want to send as good a team as we can. The Germans are sending their best players, and so are the Americans. Nothing doing, old boy. In the first place, Nicky's not good enough. And secondly, I don't fancy the idea of sending a kid like that to Monte Carlo without anyone to look after him. If I could get away myself, I might think of it, but that's out of the question. I shall be there. I'm going as the non-playing captain of the English team. I'll keep an eye on him. You'll be busy, and besides, it's not a responsibility I'd like to ask you to take. He's never been abroad in his life, and to tell you the truth, I shouldn't have a moment's peace all the time he was there. They left it at that, and presently Henry Garnet went home. He was so flattered by Colonel Brabazon's suggestion that he could not help telling his wife. Fancy his thinking Nicky's as good as that. He told me he'd seen him play and his style was fine. He only wants more practice to get into the first flight. We shall see the kid playing in the semi-finals at Wimbledon yet, old girl. To his surprise, Mrs. Garnet was not so much opposed to the notion as he would have expected. After all, the boy's 18. Nicky's never got into mischief yet, and there's no reason to suppose he will now. There's his work to be considered, don't forget that. I think it would be a very bad precedent to let him cut the end of term. But what can 3 days matter? It seems a shame to rob him of a chance like that. I'm sure he'd jump at it if you asked him. Well, I'm not going to. I haven't sent him to Cambridge just to play tennis. I know he's steady, but it's silly to put temptation in his way. He's much too young to go to Monte Carlo by himself. You say he won't have a chance against these crack players, but you can't tell. Henry Garnet sighed a little. On the way home in the car, it had struck him that Austen's health was uncertain, and that Von Cram had his off days. Supposing, just for the sake of argument, that Nicky had a bit of luck like that, then there would be no doubt that he would be chosen to play for Cambridge. But of course, that was all nonsense. Nothing doing, my dear. I've made up my mind, and I'm not going to change it. Mrs. Garnet held her peace. But next day she wrote to Nicky, telling him what had happened, and suggested to him what she would do in his place if, wanting to go, he wished to get his father's consent. A day or two later, Henry Garnet received a letter from his son. He was bubbling over with excitement. He had seen his tutor, who was a tennis player himself, and the provost of his college, who happened to know Colonel Brabazon, and no objection would be made to his leaving before the end of term. They both thought it an opportunity that shouldn't be missed. He didn't see what harm he could come to, and if only, just this once, his father would stretch a point. Well, next term, he promised faithfully, he'd work like blazes. It was a very pretty letter. Mrs. Garnet watched her husband read it at the breakfast table. She was undisturbed by the frown on his face. He threw it over to her. I don't know why you thought it necessary to tell Nicky something I told you in confidence. It's too bad of you. Now you've thoroughly unsettled him. I'm sorry. I thought it would please him to know that Colonel Brabazon had such a high opinion of him. I don't see why one should only tell people the disagreeable things that are said about them. Of course, I made it quite clear that there could be no question of his going. You've put me in an odious position. If there's anything I hate, it's for the boy to look upon me as a spoil-sport and a tyrant. Oh, he'll never do that. He may think you rather silly and unreasonable, but I'm sure he'll understand that it's only for his own good that you're being so unkind. Christ, said Henry Garnet. His wife had a great inclination to laugh. She knew the battle was won. Dear, oh dear, how easy it was to get men to do what you wanted. For appearance sake, Henry Garnet held out for 48 hours, but then he yielded, and a fortnight later, Nicky came to London. He was to start for Monte Carlo next morning, and after dinner, when Mrs. Garnet and her elder daughter had left them, Henry took the opportunity to give his son some good advice. I don't feel quite comfortable about letting you go off to a place like Monte Carlo at your age practically by yourself, he finished. But there it is, and I can only hope you'll be sensible. I don't want to play the heavy father, but there are 3 things especially that I want to warn you against. 1 is gambling, don't gamble. The 2nd is money, don't lend anyone money. And the 3rd is women. Don't have anything to do with women. If you don't do any of those 3 things, you can't come to much harm. So remember them well. All right, father, Nicky smiled. That's my last word to you. I know the world pretty well, and believe me, My advice is sound. I won't forget it. I promise you. That's a good chap. Now let's go up and join the ladies. Nicky beat neither Austin nor Von Cram in the Monte Carlo tournament, but he did not disgrace himself. He snatched an unexpected victory over a Spanish player and gave one of the Austrians a closer match than anyone had thought possible. In the mixed doubles, he got into the semi-finals. His charm conquered everyone, and he vastly enjoyed himself. It was generally allowed that he showed promise, and Colonel Brabazon told him that, when he was a little older and had had more practice with first-class players, he would be a credit to his father. The tournament came to an end, and the day following he was to fly back to London. Anxious to play his best, he had lived very carefully, smoking little and drinking nothing, and going to bed early. But on his last evening, he thought he would like to see something of the life in Monte Carlo of which he had heard so much. An official dinner was given to the tennis players, and after dinner with the rest of them, he went into the sporting club. It was the first time he had been there. Monte Carlo was very full and the rooms were crowded. Nicky had never before seen roulette played, except in the pictures. In a maze, he stopped at the first table he came to. Chips of different sizes were scattered over the green cloth in what looked like a hopeless muddle. The croupier gave the wheel a sharp turn and with a flick threw in the little white ball. After what seemed an endless time, the ball stopped, and another croupier, with a broad, indifferent gesture, raked in the chips of those who had lost. Presently, Nicky wandered over to where they were playing trente et quarante, but he couldn't understand what it was all about, and he thought it dull. He saw a crowd in another room and sauntered in. A big game of baccarat was in progress, and he was immediately conscious of the tension. The players were protected from the thronging bystanders by a brass rail. They sat round the table, 9 on each side, with the dealer in the middle and the croupier facing him. Big money was changing hands. The dealer was a member of the Greek syndicate. Nicky looked at his impassive face. His eyes were watchful, but his expression never changed, whether he won or lost. It was a terrifying, strangely impressive sight. It gave Nicky, who had been thriftily brought up, a peculiar thrill to see someone risk £1,000 on the turn of a card, and when he lost, make a little joke and laugh. It was all terribly exciting. An acquaintance came up to him. "Been doing any good?" he asked. "I haven't been playing." "Wise of you. Rotten game. Come and have a drink." "All right." While they were having it, Nicky told his friends that this was the first time he had ever been in the rooms. "Oh, but you must have one little flutter before you go. It's idiotic to leave Monte without having tried your luck. After all, it won't hurt you to lose 100 francs or so." "I don't suppose it will, but my father wasn't any too keen on my coming at all, and one of the 3 things he particularly advised me not to do was to gamble." But when Nicky left his companion, he strolled back to one of the tables where they were playing roulette. He stood for a while, looking at the losers' money being raked in by the croupier, and the money that was won paid out to the winners. It was impossible to deny that it was thrilling. His friend was right. It did seem silly to leave Monte without putting something on the table just once. It would be an experience, and at his age you had to have all the experience you could get. He reflected that he hadn't promised his father not to gamble. He'd promised him not to forget his advice. It wasn't quite the same, was it? He took a 100-franc note out of his pocket and rather shyly put it on number 18. He chose it because that was his age. With a wildly beating heart, he watched the wheel turn. The little white ball whizzed about like a small demon of mischief. The wheel went round more slowly. The little white ball hesitated. It seemed about to stop. It went on again. Nicky could hardly believe his eyes when it fell into number 18. A lot of chips were passed over to him, and his hands trembled as he took them. It seemed to amount to a lot of money. He was so confused that he never thought of putting anything on the following round. In fact, he had no intention of playing any more. Once was enough, and he was surprised when 18 again came up. There was only 1 chip on it. "By George, you've won again," said a man who was standing near to him. "Me? I hadn't got anything on." Yes, you had. Your original stake. They always leave it on, unless you ask for it back. Didn't you know? Another packet of chips was handed over to him. Nicky's head reeled. He counted his gains. 7,000 francs. A queer sense of power seized him. He felt wonderfully clever. This was the easiest way of making money that he had ever heard of. His frank, charming face was wreathed in smiles. His bright eyes met those of a woman standing by his side. She smiled. "You're in luck," she said. She spoke English, but with a foreign accent. "I can hardly believe it. It's the first time I've ever played." "That explains it. Lend me 1,000 francs, will you? I've lost everything I've got. I'll give it you back in half an hour." "All right." She took a large red chip from his pile and, with a word of thanks, disappeared. The man who had spoken to him before grunted. "You'll never see that again." Nicky was dashed. His father had particularly advised him not to lend anyone money. What a silly thing to do, and to somebody he'd never seen in his life. But the fact was, he felt at that moment such a love for the human race that it had never occurred to him to refuse. And that big red chip, it was almost impossible to realize that it had any value. Oh well, it didn't matter. He still had 6,000 francs. He'd just try his luck once or twice more, and if he didn't win, he'd go home. He put a chip on 16, which was his elder sister's age, but it didn't come up. Then on 12, which was his younger sister's, and that didn't come up either. He tried various numbers at random, but without success. It was funny, he seemed to have lost his knack. He thought he would try just once more, and then stop. He won. He had made up all his losses, and had something over. At the end of an hour, after various ups and downs, having experienced such thrills as he had never known in his life, he found himself with so many chips that they would hardly go in his pockets. He decided to go. He went to the changer's office, and he gasped when 20,000 franc notes were spread out before him. He had never had so much money in his life. He put it in his pocket and was turning away when the woman to whom he had lent the 1,000 francs came up to him. "I've been looking for you everywhere," she said. "I was afraid you'd gone. I was in a fever. I didn't know what you'd think of me. Here's your 1,000 francs, and thank you so much for the loan." Nicky, blushing scarlet, stared at her with amazement. How he had misjudged her. His father had said, "Don't gamble." Well, he had, and he'd made 20,000 francs. And his father had said, "Don't lend anyone money." Well, he had. He'd lent quite a lot to a total stranger, and she'd returned it. The fact was that he wasn't nearly such a fool as his father thought. He'd had an instinct that he could lend her the money with safety, and you see, his instinct was right. But he was so obviously taken aback that the little lady was forced to laugh. "What is the matter with you?" she asked. "To tell you the truth, I never expected to see the money back." "What did you take me for? Did you think I was a cocotte?" Nicky reddened to the roots of his wavy hair. "No, of course not." "Do I look like one?" "Not a bit." She was dressed very quietly, in black, with a string of gold beads round her neck. Her simple frock showed off a neat, slight figure. She had a pretty little face and a trim head. She was made up, but not excessively, and Nicky supposed that she was not more than 3 or 4 years older than himself. She gave him a friendly smile. "My husband is in the administration in Morocco, and I've come to Monte Carlo for a few weeks, because he thought I wanted a change." "I was just going," said Nicky, because he couldn't think of anything else to say. "Already?" "Well, I've got to get up early tomorrow. I'm going back to London by air." "Of course. The tournament ended today, didn't it? I saw you play, 2 or 3 times." "Did you? I don't know why you should have noticed me. You've got a beautiful style, and you looked very sweet in your shorts." Nicky was not an immodest youth, but it did cross his mind that perhaps she had borrowed that 1,000 francs in order to scrape acquaintance with him. "Do you ever go to the Knickerbocker?" she asked. "No, I never have." "Oh, but you mustn't leave Monte Carlo without having been there. Why don't you come and dance a little?" To tell you the truth, I'm starving with hunger, and I should adore some bacon and eggs." Nicky remembered his father's advice not to have anything to do with women, but this was different. You had only to look at the pretty little thing to know at once that she was perfectly respectable. Her husband was in what corresponded, he supposed, to the civil service. His father and mother had friends who were civil servants, and they and their wives sometimes came to dinner. It was true that the wives were neither so young nor so pretty as this one, but she was just as ladylike as they were, and after winning 20,000 francs, he thought it wouldn't be a bad idea to have a little fun. "I'd love to go with you," he said, "but you won't mind if I don't stay very long. I've left instructions at my hotel that I'm to be called at 7. We'll leave as soon as ever you like." Nicky found it very pleasant at the Knickerbocker. He ate his bacon and eggs with appetite. They shared a bottle of champagne. They danced, and the little lady told him he danced beautifully. He knew he danced pretty well, and of course she was easy to dance with. As light as a feather, she laid her cheek against his, and when their eyes met, there was in hers a smile that made his heart go pit-a-pat. A coloured woman sang in a throaty, sensual voice. The floor was crowded. "Have you ever been told that you're very good-looking?" she asked. "I don't think so," he laughed. "Gosh," he thought, "I believe she's fallen for me." Nicky was not such a fool as to be unaware that women often liked him, and when she made that remark, he pressed her to him a little more closely. She closed her eyes and a faint sigh escaped her lips. "I suppose it wouldn't be quite nice if I kissed you before all these people," he said. "What do you think they would take me for?" It began to grow late, and Nicky said that really he thought he ought to be going. "I shall go too," she said. "Will you drop me at my hotel on your way?" Nicky paid the bill. He was rather surprised at its amount, but with all that money he had in his pocket, he could afford not to care, and they got into a taxi. She snuggled up to him, and he kissed her. She seemed to like it. "By Jove," he thought, "I wonder if there's anything doing." It was true that she was a married woman, but her husband was in Morocco, and it certainly did look as if she'd fallen for him. Good and proper. It was true also that his father had warned him to have nothing to do with women. But, he reflected again, he hadn't actually promised he wouldn't. He'd only promised not to forget his advice. Well, he hadn't. He was bearing it in mind that very minute. But circumstances alter cases. She was a sweet little thing. It seemed silly to miss the chance of an adventure when it was handed to you like that on a tray. When they reached the hotel, he paid off the taxi. "I'll walk home," he said. "The air will do me good after the stuffy atmosphere of that place." "Come up a moment," she said. "I'd like to show you the photo of my little boy." "Oh, have you got a little boy?" he exclaimed, a trifle dashed. "Yes, a sweet little boy." He walked upstairs after her. He didn't in the least want to see the photograph of her little boy, but he thought it only civil to pretend he did. He was afraid he'd made a fool of himself. It occurred to him that she was taking him up to look at the photograph in order to show him in a nice way that he'd made a mistake. He'd told her he was 18. "I suppose she thinks I'm just a kid." He began to wish he hadn't spent all that money on champagne at the nightclub. But she didn't show him the photograph of her little boy after all. They had no sooner got into her room than she turned to him, flung her arms round his neck, and kissed him full on the lips. He had never in all his life been kissed so passionately. "Darling," she said. For a brief moment, his father's advice once more crossed Nicky's mind, and then he forgot it. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Nicky was a light sleeper, and the least sound was apt to wake him. 2 or 3 hours later, he awoke and for a moment could not imagine where he was. The room was not quite dark, for the door of the bathroom was ajar, and the light in it had been left on. Suddenly, he was conscious that someone was moving about the room. Then he remembered. He saw that it was his little friend, and he was on the point of speaking when something in the way she was behaving stopped him. She was walking very cautiously, as though she were afraid of waking him. She stopped once or twice and looked over at the bed. He wondered what she was after. He soon saw. She went over to the chair on which he had placed his clothes and once more looked in his direction. She waited for what seemed to him an interminable time. The silence was so intense that Nicky thought he could hear his own heart beating. Then, very slowly, very quietly, she took up his coat, slipped her hand into the inside pocket, and drew out all those beautiful 1,000-franc notes that Nicky had been so proud to win. She put the coat back and placed some other clothes on it, so that it should look as though it had not been disturbed. Then, with the bundle of notes in her hand, for an appreciable time stood once more stock still. Nicky had repressed an instinctive impulse to jump up and grab her. It was partly surprise that had kept him quiet, partly the notion that he was in a strange hotel, in a foreign country, and if he made a row, he didn't know what might happen. She looked at him. His eyes were partly closed, and he was sure that she thought he was asleep. In the silence, she could hardly fail to hear his regular breathing. When she had reassured herself that her movements had not disturbed him, she stepped, with infinite caution, across the room. On a small table in the window, a cineraria was growing in a pot. Nicky watched her now, with his eyes wide open. The plant was evidently placed quite loosely in the pot. For taking it by the stalks, she lifted it out. She put the banknotes in the bottom of the pot and replaced the plant. It was an excellent hiding place. No one could have guessed that anything was concealed under that richly flowering plant. She pressed the earth down with her fingers and then, very slowly, taking care not to make the smallest noise, crept across the room and slipped back into bed. "Chérie," she said in a caressing voice. Nicky breathed steadily, like a man immersed in deep sleep. The little lady turned over on her side and disposed herself to slumber. But though Nicky lay so still, his thoughts worked busily. He was extremely indignant at the scene he had just witnessed, and to himself he spoke his thoughts with vigor. She's nothing but a damned tart. She and her dear little boy and her husband in Morocco. My eye! She's a rotten thief, that's what she is. Took me for a mug. If she thinks she's going to get away with anything like that, she's mistaken. He had already made up his mind what he was going to do with the money he had so cleverly won. He had long wanted a car of his own and had thought it rather mean of his father not to have given him one. After all, a fella doesn't always want to drive about in the family bus. Well, he'd just teach the old man a lesson and buy one himself. For 20,000 francs, £200 roughly, he could get a very decent second-hand car. He meant to get the money back, but just then he didn't quite know how. He didn't like the idea of kicking up a row. He was a stranger, in an hotel he knew nothing of. It might very well be that the beastly woman had friends there. He didn't mind facing anyone in a fair fight, but he'd look pretty foolish if someone pulled a gun on him. He reflected besides, very sensibly, that he had no proof the money was his. If it came to a showdown and she swore it was hers, he might very easily find himself hauled off to a police station. He really didn't know what to do. Presently, by her regular breathing, he knew that the little lady was asleep. She must have fallen asleep with an easy mind, for she had done her job without a hitch. It infuriated Nicky that she should rest so peacefully while he lay awake, worried to death. Suddenly an idea occurred to him. It was such a good one that it was only by the exercise of all his self-control that he prevented himself from jumping out of bed and carrying it out at once. Two could play at her game. She'd stolen his money. Well, he'd steal it back again, and they'd be all square. He made up his mind to wait quite quietly until he was sure that deceitful woman was sound asleep. He waited for what seemed to him a very long time. She did not stir. Her breathing was as regular as a child's. "Darling," he said at last. No answer, no movement. She was dead to the world. Very slowly, pausing after every movement, very silently, he slipped out of bed. He stood still for a while, looking at her to see whether he had disturbed her. Her breathing was as regular as before. During the time he was waiting, he had taken note carefully of the furniture in the room, so that in crossing it he should not knock against a chair or a table and make a noise. He took a couple of steps and waited. He took a couple of steps more. He was very light on his feet and made no sound as he walked. He took fully 5 minutes to get to the window, and here he waited again. He started, for the bed slightly creaked, but it was only because the sleeper turned in her sleep. He forced himself to wait till he had counted 100. She was sleeping like a log. With infinite care, he seized the cineraria by the stalks and gently pulled it out of the pot. He put his other hand in, his heart beat 19 to the dozen as his fingers touched the notes. His hand closed on them, and he slowly drew them out. He replaced the plant, and in his turn carefully pressed down the earth. While he was doing all this, he had kept one eye on the form lying in the bed. It remained still. After another pause, he crept softly to the chair on which his clothes were lying. He first put the bundle of notes in his coat pocket and then proceeded to dress. It took him a good quarter of an hour, because he could afford to make no sound. He had been wearing a soft shirt with his dinner jacket, and he congratulated himself on this, because it was easier to put on silently than a stiff one. He had some difficulty in tying his tie without a looking-glass, but he very wisely reflected that it didn't really matter if it wasn't tied very well. His spirits were rising. The whole thing now began to seem rather a lark. At length he was completely dressed, except for his shoes, which he took in his hand. He thought he would put them on when he got into the passage. Now he had to cross the room to get to the door. He reached it so quietly that he could not have disturbed the lightest sleeper. But the door had to be unlocked. He turned the key very slowly. It creaked. "Who's that?" The little woman suddenly sat up in bed. Nicky's heart jumped to his mouth. He made a great effort to keep his head. "It's only me. It's 6 o'clock and I've got to go. I was trying not to wake you." "Oh, I forgot." She sank back onto the pillow. "Now that you're awake, I'll put on my shoes." He sat down on the edge of the bed and did this. "Don't make a noise when you go out. The hotel people don't like it." "Oh, I'm so sleepy." "You go right off to sleep again. Kiss me before you go." He bent down and kissed her. "You're a sweet boy and a wonderful lover. Bon voyage." Nicky did not feel quite safe till he got out of the hotel. The dawn had broken, the sky was unclouded, and in the harbour the yachts and the fishing boats lay motionless on the still water. On the quay, fishermen were getting ready to start on their day's work. The streets were deserted. Nicky took a long breath of the sweet morning air. He felt alert and well. He also felt as pleased as Punch. With a swinging stride, his shoulders well thrown back, he walked up the hill and along the gardens in front of the casino. The flowers in that clear light had a dewy brilliance that was delicious, till he came to his hotel. Here the day had already begun. In the hall, porters with mufflers round their necks and berets on their heads were busy sweeping. Nicky went up to his room and had a hot bath. He lay in it and thought with satisfaction that he was not such a mug as some people might think. After his bath, he did his exercises, dressed, packed, and went down to breakfast. He had a grand appetite. No continental breakfast for him. He had grapefruit, porridge, bacon and eggs, rolls fresh from the oven, so crisp and delicious they melted in your mouth, marmalade and 3 cups of coffee. Though feeling perfectly well before, he felt better after that. He lit the pipe he had recently learnt to smoke, paid his bill, and stepped into the car that was waiting to take him to the aerodrome on the other side of Cannes. The road as far as Nice ran over the hills, and below him was the blue sea and the coastline. He couldn't help thinking it damned pretty. They passed through Nice, so gay and friendly in the early morning, and presently they came to a long stretch of straight road that ran by the sea. Nicky had paid his bill, not with the money he had won the night before, but with the money his father had given him. He had changed 1,000 francs to pay for supper at the Knickerbocker, but that deceitful little woman had returned him the 1,000 francs he had lent her, so that he still had 20,000-franc notes in his pocket. He thought he would like to have a look at them. He had so nearly lost them that they had a double value for him. He took them out of his hip pocket, into which, for safety's sake, he had stuffed them when he put on the suit he was travelling in, and counted them one by one. Something very strange had happened to them. Instead of there being 20 notes, as there should have been, there were 26. He couldn't understand it at all. He counted them twice more. There was no doubt about it. Somehow or other, he had 26,000 francs, instead of the 20 should have had. He couldn't make it out. He asked himself if it was possible that he had won more at the sporting club than he had realized. But no, that was out of the question. He distinctly remembered the man at the desk laying the notes out in 4 rows of 5, and he had counted them himself. Suddenly the explanation occurred to him. When he had put his hand into the flower pot, after taking out the cineraria, he had grabbed everything he felt there. The flower pot was the little hussie's money box, and he had taken out not only his own money, but her savings as well. Nicky leant back in the car and burst into a roar of laughter. It was the funniest thing he had ever heard in his life, and when he thought of her going to the flower pot sometime later in the morning, when she awoke, expecting to find the money she had so cleverly got away with, and finding not only that it wasn't there, but that her own had gone too, he laughed more than ever. And so far as he was concerned, there was nothing to do about it. He neither knew her name nor the name of the hotel to which she had taken him. He couldn't return her money even if he wanted to. "It serves her damned well right," he said. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. This then was the story that Henry Garnet told his friends over the bridge table. For the night before, after dinner when his wife and daughter had left them to their port, Nicky had narrated it in full. And you know what infuriated me is that he's so damned pleased with himself. Talk of a cat swallowing a canary. And do you know what he said to me when he'd finished? He looked at me with those innocent eyes of his and said, "You know, Father, I can't help thinking there was something wrong about the advice you gave me. You said, 'Don't gamble.' Well, I did, and I made a packet. You said, 'Don't lend money.' Well, I did, and I got it back. And you said, 'Don't have anything to do with women.' Well, I did, and I made 6,000 francs on the deal." It didn't make it any better for Henry Garnet that his 3 companions burst out laughing. "It's all very well for you fellows to laugh, but you know, I'm in a damned awkward position. The boy looked up to me, he respected me, he took whatever I said as gospel truth, and now I saw it in his eyes. He just looks upon me as a drivelling old fool. It's no good my saying, 'One swallow doesn't make a summer.' He doesn't see that it was just a fluke. He thinks the whole thing was due to his own cleverness. It may ruin him." "You do look a bit of a damned fool, old man," said one of the others. "There's no denying that, is there?" "I know I do, and I don't like it. It's so dashed unfair. Fate has no right to play one tricks like that. After all, you must admit that my advice was good." "Very good." "And the wretched boy ought to have burnt his fingers." "Well, he hasn't. You're all men of the world. You tell me how I'm to deal with the situation now." But they none of them could. "Well, Henry, if I were you, I wouldn't worry," said the lawyer. "My belief is that your boy's born lucky, and in the long run, that's better than to be born clever or rich.